Hi there, this is NikitaNet, and excuse the raspy voice because I've been recording this video over and over again to keep it short and succinct, which apparently I can't do, so let's just muddle through and get started. So I've tackled a new project, upgrading or uprating the router I've been using. Well, a router I've been using to be exact, and this is a PC based router, so basically PC hardware. In it was this CPU, this AMD Athlon 64 3200 Plus. It's a 46-bit CPU which ran quite nicely, quite coolly with the cooler that was on there. So to enhance the situation, I decided to get a second-hand AMD Athlon 64 X2 5200 Plus, from 3200 Plus to 5000 Plus, a different generation, one could say, of CPU, even though they're both AM2 sockets and a dual core instead of this single core. So basically I opened up the computer, cleaned out all the dust that was in there, put it on the bench, pulled the old CPU cooler, pulled the old, CPU that's right here, installed the new CPU that's in there right now, applied some nice Arctic Silver 5 thermal grease, and installed this Gelid Siberian Pro that's on the desk right here. After doing that, I basically, ran the test I ran earlier that day, and that's in the BIOS, the CPU temperature tab, which means that the CPU should get loaded to 50% of its capability to ensure visually to the end user or to the computer builder that it doesn't get too hot. And with this Gelid Siberian Pro, unfortunately it did get too hot. So I doubted my installation, basically opened the computer up in situ, checked the plug, was it installed, and it was the CPU cooler seated properly, and it was. So I had to make a little decision, and that was basically to pull this CPU cooler and install the old one to get a proper baseline comparisons, which meant basically deinstalling this thing. And there the problem arose that this thing didn't want to be detached from the motherboard. Now, I'm putting on gloves because I've already cleaned this thing and I don't want to get it dirty again, because it's going back to the shop. But basically these tabs, were an issue. There was a standard AMD socket on the AM2 socket motherboard, which is an Asus M2N, if I remember correctly. But basically there's a bracket like this on the motherboard which basically holds the CPU cooler in situ via these clips. So this tab attaches to these clips, which is spring loaded, and I couldn't undo these in any fashion. I was gentle, I was a little bit rougher with them, but they wouldn't detach. Even when completely pressed down, I couldn't unhook them. Right? So I had to detach this, the bracket that's on the motherboard itself, which is a major hassle. And let me check. Okay, I have to turn that clockwise a bit, or counterclockwise, doesn't really matter, but I had to unscrew with a screwdriver basically the screws that run through that specific bracket on that AM2 motherboard, which means that on the other side of the motherboard, the supporting back brace, it's a little plate in which the screws screw in, detached from the motherboard because it wasn't attached to those screws anymore, because I had to pull them out. Now, if you've ever been in such a situation, you know what a hassle that is, because basically to reattach the original bracket to the motherboard with the screws to the back plate and screw them in, you have to flip over the computer and work from down up with a screwdriver with those screws on there while keeping everything aligned. Or you have to pull the motherboard. Well, option 1 was a little bit simpler, although a big hassle. So I reapplied or applied some fresh Arctic Silver 5 to that new CPU and attached the old heatsink that was on this CPU. Closed everything up again after checking and double checking everything and powered it on. And to my surprise, that old CPU cooler performs better than this Gelid Siberian Pro. Now I inspected the thermal paste I put on the CPU on this shiny part after I pulled this Gelid Siberian Pro, and it was properly applied. A little bit too much, but it seeped out to the edges. The coverage was proper, was nice, not too much, not too little, proper coverage. So my conclusion at the moment is that the old CPU cooler with that old fan that has to be replaced, by my estimation at least, because of the time it's been running at least, that old CPU cooler outperforms this Gelid Siberian Pro, which is a little bit disappointing because on the box is stated that this thing can support 100 watt TDP on the AM2 socket. Right, 100 watt TDP, Athlon 64X2. So it should suffice. And in most situations I hope it does suffice. But for my combination of hardware, this thing won't work. It runs too hot. And with too hot I mean over 50 degrees centigrade with half a CPU load, while the old cooler on the new CPU runs about 45 to 44 degrees Celsius. Of course Celsius, but hey, that's that. With that in mind, I do have to say that this older CPU runs cooler, about 34 to 35 degrees Celsius with the old cooler. Now the difference between this one and the one that's now installed in that system is of course an extra core and 600 megahertz extra clock frequency. But there's another difference. This CPU is a generation, quote unquote, in fabrication technique older than the new one. And the microns of the lanes that run through this chip are larger than on the new ones, which should in theory at least mean that although there are more megahertz, and although there are two cores, it should be more energy efficient in some regards. But the second core will make a 10 to 12 degree difference, as I've measured it, with that old cooler on both chips. So this Siberian Pro will be returned to the shop. I've cleaned it, and unfortunately I think it won't function properly on my CPU in the system I've built, although even it specifies the 100 watt TDP. And the reason behind that is because it was running at 2200 RPM, as is specified as the maximum operating rating for this fan. So just one of those things, a nice project, a simple install, which turns basically into a little bit of a problem, and me looking for another cooler that's at least better than the one that was previously in here and installed on this one. So this is NikitaNet saying, I hope you found this video interesting. Like or dislike this video at your pleasure, of course. Subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.